watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and welcome to part 1 of my Ultimate Spider-Man Mega Review. Now, before I talk about the actual comic series Ultimate Spider-Man, I feel like I have to give you some context for what the Ultimate Universe is, or was, or still is, because it's coming back, I think, I don't know. Anyway, so, the Ultimate Universe is basically our world in the year 2000 with superheroes in it. It's very much an alternate history, not unlike Watchmen, in the sense that the only major differences between our world and the Ultimate Universe is that in the Ultimate Universe, people with superpowers and aliens exist. And that has completely altered the collective human consciousness of that world, while simultaneously not altering human behavior. People are still selfish, people are still greedy, people are still extremely shallow and superficial, but whereas pop culture in our world revolves around celebrities, movies, and TV shows and whatnot, in the Ultimate Universe, pop culture revolves around superheroes and people with superpowers. But like I said, even though the collective human consciousness of that world is on a different level than ours, human behavior is constant. And this includes people in major corporations trying to bank off of this superpowered trend. And as a result, there have been systems put in place to combat this capitalistic practice of buying and selling superpowers and genetic weaponry. Chief among them is S.H.I.E.L.D., who is, for the most part, directed by Nick Fury. I know that General Thunderbolt Ross is later revealed to be a former director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he wants that position back, and later on Carol Danvers becomes the director of S.H.I.E.L.D. after Nick Fury goes AWOL, but yeah, we're not gonna get into all that right now. But anyways, with all that said, this is the world that this comic series takes place in, so by default, there's a lot of elements of corporate espionage and governmental conspiracy sprinkled throughout this book. I mean, the entire first page of this series focuses on Norman Osborn trying to fulfill a government contract to S.H.I.E.L.D. to replicate the Super Soldier Serum, and later on, it's revealed that even though we see Dr. Octopus working with him, he's actually a mole who's funneling information to Justin Hammer. Again, there is a lot of corporate espionage in this comic, but appropriately enough, most of it takes a backseat to all of the interpersonal relationship stuff between this universe's version of Peter Parker and his family and friends. And that's perfect because, for the most part, we're seeing this universe through the eyes of Peter Parker and how he goes through his day-to-day life while living in this dystopian society, not just as a high school student, but as a superhero who is technically listed by the US government as an illegal artificial genetic mutation. But what I love even more than all of that is how the celebrity of Spider-Man eventually snowballs into something that Peter can't even really control, and how he becomes a widely known figure in not just other superhero circles, but in the media, which is incredibly toxic and hostile, government organizations, and other companies that deal in illegal genetic trade and profit. And the book goes through great lengths to showcase how Peter was not ready for this level of attention, and how it almost instantly starts affecting the people in his life negatively, and only gets worse over the course of this series. And I guess that this is the perfect time to start talking about the villains, because while we see most of Spider-Man's rogues gallery appear in this first volume, such as the Enforcers, Black Cat, Silver Sable, Hammerhead, even though he's literally killed off after he's introduced, Shocker, Rhino, Electro, Kraven, a weird version of the Scorpion, Venom, and a few others, there's really just three main overarching villains, and they're Norman Osborn, Doc Ock, and the Kingpin. Now, these guys don't show up nearly as often as people would like to say they do, but when they do show up, they will either directly or indirectly cause major shakeups in Peter's life. More so Osborn and Octavius. Kingpin, relatively speaking, doesn't pose as large of a threat as the Green Goblin or Doc Ock, ironically. But he still posed a large enough threat to shake Peter to his core and really open his eyes about the extremely harsh, extremely gritty, and dirty, and broken world that he's throwing himself into blindly. But then there's Norman Osborn and Otto Octavius, and they ruin this kid's life and the lives of everyone else around him. Primarily Norman Osborn, because the first thing he ever does is show up to Peter's high school and set half of it on fire. Then, not even a few issues later, he shows up again and throws MJ off the Queensboro Bridge, giving the poor girl PTSD after that. But then he doesn't show up for a while. But when he does, he forces Peter to join the Sinister Six, and after that fails, he goes on to beat his own son to death, and then I think the next thing he does after that is kill Peter, but that's in Volume 2. But what's really crazy is his obsession with Peter, because as I said, in this universe, the cultural consciousness revolves around superpowers and genetic abnormalities. And since Peter was bitten by one of his genetically engineered super spiders, Peter has Norman's super soldier serum flowing in his veins. So he basically sees Peter as his property, and what starts out as an already kinda creepy mindset about licensing and ownership over Peter as a genetic experiment that was one of the few successful man-made super soldier projects quickly turns into a psychotic obsession with this teenage boy. So much so to the point where he starts to disown his own biological son Harry in favor of Peter. And then after Peter dies, he does the exact same thing with Miles, but we'll get there when we get there. As for Otto, he's nowhere near as active in Peter's life as the Kingpin or the Green Goblin, but I'd argue that he affects Peter's life the most out of the three, because his third solo encounter with Peter completely alters the course of his life, because this is when we get the Ultimate Clone Saga. And in this story, Peter's father, Richard Parker, seemingly comes back to life. That weird version of the Scorpion that I mentioned earlier shows up as well. All of these Peter Parker clones start running around New York, and then S.H.I.E.L.D. gets involved, and because of this, Aunt May finds out that Peter is Spider-Man and ends up having a heart attack, and MJ gets mutated into a weird, hairy goblin monster thing, and he just royally screws this kid's life up, and he shakes Peter's status quo dramatically. And I didn't even mention the fact that Otto more or less brought back Gwen Stacy from the dead as a weird, creepy Carnage symbiote. But yeah, I know that some people will disagree with me on this, and that's fine, but I think that in this first volume of Ultimate Spider-Man, Doc Ock is Peter's archenemy. Now, in terms of storytelling, the quality is consistent for the most part, and I say for the most part because while I love how Bendis keeps the momentum going in the beginning of his run, towards the middle, the writing feels less kinetic. And there are moments that feel kinda Tumblr fanfiction-y, but after reading some of Bendis' other Marvel work, I probably shouldn't complain because it's nowhere near as distracting as it is in his run on the all-new X-Men or Iron Man. That said, the stories really start to pick up that kinetic energy again once we get into the Ultimate Clone Saga, and everything from there onward starts to regain that kinetic flow that it once had in the beginning of his run. But there are very few stories that I actually don't like in this volume. The only one that I have a real problem with is the War of the Symbiote story arc, mainly because it felt extremely tacked on and was only there to force in the Ultimate Spider-Man game into continuity. But aside from that one, most of, if not all of the story arcs are pretty solid. One of my personal favorites is definitely the last in this volume, and it's the tie-in to Ultimatum. So this story arc is where everything changes. So Manhattan gets flooded because Magneto went crazy in the Ultimatum book, and Peter is just doing the best that he can with what he's got. He's jumping into the water trying to save people. He runs into the Hulk and he uses his help to rescue survivors. They also come across a few dead superheroes here and there, and J. Jonah Jameson, who has been a complete dick this entire run, is just watching all of this happen, and he's taken back by it, and you can see his reaction and how he's changing his mind about Spider-Man, and it's all just very visceral. I'm also head over heels for this universe's version of the Clone Saga. It's fantastic, and it also introduces my favorite version of Jessica Drew, where she's Peter's clone. And while I'm at it, one of my other favorite story arcs is the Deadpool arc, and I love this version of Deadpool. Here, he's a psychotic TV show host who kills mutants for sport, and instead of being a hardcore mercenary who gets cancer and gets it cured like in the main universe, here, he's one of the Reavers, and he's the most advanced cyborg on the team. And it's really weird and cool, and I dug it a lot. And speaking of which, let's talk about some of the characters and things that are different between the main universe and the Ultimate Universe. The biggest difference is obviously Peter's character. He's far more bold in this universe than he ever was in the original Stan Lee Steve Ditko era. He's also far less reclusive. One of the things that people forget about Peter in the 616 universe is that he was very abrasive around people his own age, but here, he's not. He's actually a really accepting person. That said, he's very spastic, far more than 616 Peter ever was, and part of that is stress. And to be fair, in the 70s and some of the 80s, Peter had moments that would make me question his sanity, but for the most part, he kept his cool, but not in the Ultimate Universe. Ultimate Peter is easily stressed out and has a serious tendency to lash out at people. Then there's MJ. Now, MJ in the Ultimate Universe is nowhere near as damaged as her 616 counterpart, and while her father is revealed to be an abusive asshole, he's dealt with very early on. Also, MJ is more of a nerd in this universe than she was in the original, and this actually puts her on equal footing intellectually with Peter, which I find pretty interesting. Gwen is also extremely different from her 616 counterpart. First and foremost, she actually has a personality in this universe, but more so than that, she's this punk rock, fuck the established order kind of chick. and she's really cool. And once her dad dies, she goes on to live with Peter and Aunt May, which is also very different, and leads to them having a cute brother-sister relationship, which turns into a romantic relationship later on, but I'll get into that in Volume 2. There's a few other changes as well, such as Flash Thompson having a hype man named Kong, and instead of Flash being a Spider-Man fanboy, that role is filled by Kong, who would go on to figure out that Peter is Spider-Man, and funny enough, he's actually one of the only people to figure this out, which I find hilarious. Also, Kitty Pryde of the X-Men starts dating Peter at one point, and actually turns out to be one of those overly obsessed girlfriends. Liz Allen turns out to be a mutant in this universe, which is also hilarious because up until her reveal as being this universe's Firestar, she's insanely mutant-phobic. Also, I forgot to mention this, but Norman Osborn is a literal goblin monster in this universe, so yeah, that's different. Also, Kraven has animal-based superpowers, Electro is a genetic experiment gone wrong, the Venom symbiote is actually not from space, but much rather a suit that Peter's father created to cure cancer. The list goes on, but those are among the major changes to the mythology. And I haven't even mentioned the art yet. God, it's fantastic. Now, Mark Bagley does most of it. Later on in the series, he leaves Marvel to do work for DC, but after he leaves, he's replaced by Stuart Immonen, whose art really fits the tone of Bendis' storytelling in that era of Ultimate Spider-Man. And finally, we have Dave LaFuenta, who I love on this book, and even though he only does the third annual, he becomes the main artist in Volume 2. And again, a lot of Ultimate Spider-Man fans are going to disagree with me on this, but I think his art is great. And it's funny because he's the only one who actually draws Peter and his friends like kids, like they should. So I just thought that was funny. Anyways, that's it for Volume 1. I know that this video is going to be long, but I can guarantee that this will be the longest video in the series. But yeah, I can't wait to tackle the first half of Volume 2 with you guys. I know that that will be awesome. But yeah, what did you think of Ultimate Spider-Man Volume 1? Let me know down below in the comments section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios, nachos, adios.